Gangs, violence, and more. Oh boy, this is going to be lovely. Yes, my friends, today we're going to be diving into something that is truly unique in the realm of geopolitical and historical coverage. An outlier that is simply like no place else on Earth right now. With an explosion of gang violence as well as violent explosions, this country has seemingly lost control of itself and lost the plot when it comes to handling immigration, as well as failing to ensure the safety of its own people. We're not talking about the United States and anything at the southern border, my friends. No, we're talking about Sweden. Now, for those of you that are watching right now, when many people think of Sweden, they probably think about Vikings, the band ABBA, Swedish meatballs, IKEA, the word smorgasbord, among other things, coffee culture, saunas, etc. Or perhaps they think of the Lapland region that looks straight out of the movie Frozen, or the Northern Lights that prominently are on display for large portions of the year. But what people didn't really think about Sweden until fairly recently was crime, or bombings. Unfortunately, the reality is that whether you've seen the coverage or not, in the past decade or two, Sweden has descended into shocking levels of violence, from one of the safest places in the world to one of the most dangerous places in Europe, something that has been distinctly characterized by the heavy use of explosive devices. But in order to explain the situation here in the first place, my friends, we're going to need to explain some context. But hey, in comparison to everything that I've been talking about, if you want to go somewhere with a little bit less trouble right now, then you should definitely join me on my trip to Japan. I'm actually launching a second Japan trip tomorrow, at least at the time that this video is going out here right now, to Japan, where we are going to be hiking around Mount Fuji. We're going to be exploring Tokyo, we're going to be exploring Shizuoka, we're going to be going to Hakone, we're going to be going to all these different places with hot springs. Look, it's going to be really nice, and just to be blunt with you all, the last Japan trip that I launched that is actually happening this same month sold out within the first day, so definitely jump on this while you have a chance. I'm going to leave a link to the entire thing down in my description. Remember, it only requires a 25% down payment, but besides that, I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Sweden, my friends, lies in the heart of Scandinavia. It is west of Finland and plays little spoon to Norway's big spoon, and it's got a population of around 11 million people. It's a big place with not necessarily all that many people in it. Since World War II, Sweden has been a land of immigration, and due to its relatively low population at the time, they welcomed these citizens with open arms. Initially, it was mostly German immigrants, as well as travelers from throughout the Nordic and Baltic regions. Then after this, you had Italians and Greeks that began to show up more commonly through the 1960s and 70s. But when I talk about this was not millions of migrants. No, these migrants came by the thousands, and even then, many of them returned home when their home country's economies improved. Basically, before the 1980s, Sweden was putting up rookie numbers.
3 or 4 times, maybe.
I'm gonna pump those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers in this racket.
And they were about to pump those immigration numbers way up. You see, my friends, the Swedes are overall a very welcoming and kind people. People who have always prided themselves in offering refuge to those in need. So as the Cold War reached its end, they just kept welcoming refugees. But they had no real idea as to just how many refugees would take them up on that offer. You see, suddenly people were showing up from all over the place, including the South American country of Chile. In fact, during Augusto Pinochet's brutal regime from 1973 to 1990, so many Chileans moved to Sweden that it is now home to the third largest Chilean community outside of Chile, behind only Argentina and the United States, at some 45,000 people. The Iraqis would be another group, which would come in 2 waves. First in the 1980s, and then again in the 2000s, after the US invasion in 2003. Tens of thousands of these individuals would arrive on Sweden's shores. The Somalians would come fleeing after their own civil war by the thousands in the 1990s, and Sweden was a popular destination for those from the Balkans. Over 100,000 Bosnians alone fled to Sweden, seeking new opportunities, and that's not including the thousands from other Balkan countries that eventually made their way to the land of furniture. As well as refugees, around 30,000 people would emigrate to Sweden who would seek work opportunities after the country joined the Schengen zone. These people would stay and have children in many cases, and so for a while, Sweden had a fairly healthy level of immigration. And again, remember when I've talked about it, we've talked about in the thousands, the tens of thousands, even in one case, 100,000, but it's not millions. But then, the Syrians came. Starting in 2011, when the Syrian civil war kicked off, Syrian refugees began pouring into the country. Eventually, over 200,000 Syrians would find safety in Sweden. And out of countries outside of the Middle East and Turkey, only Germany accepted more Syrians than Sweden did. This reached a peak around 2015 of 162,000 immigrants overall in 2016. From the year 2010 to 2020, Sweden accepted nearly 800,000 immigrants. By this point, in the present day, 1 out of every 4 people in Sweden is an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. But it wasn't in 2015 that the country's problems with immigrants began. No, these problems actually started nearly a decade prior, but that's not what people typically focus on, as they like to talk about just the current issue. In our case, though, you know that we always have to talk about context. You see, my friends, a series of violent riots would erupt in the late 2000s, with just some examples being the 2008 Malmö Mosque riot, the 2009 Malmö anti-Israel riots, the 2010 Rinkeby riots, and the 2013 Stockholm riots. These riots rocked the typical peaceful country and consisted mostly of groups of young immigrants. They would torch cars and buildings, throw rocks at police, and this would lead many Swedes to start to question Sweden's ability to integrate migrants in the first place. Still, on paper, no other country has taken in more refugees in relation to its total population than Sweden has, and overall, the country at the time was still very pro-immigrant. So then, in this case, now we know how the immigrants got to Sweden. But what happened when they got there? Well, in the post-World War II period, successive governments made the case for integration, providing Swedish language lessons while also supporting a large number of migrant associations. In 1975, the Swedish government even passed legislation allowing any migrant who had lived in Sweden for more than 3 years to vote in municipal elections and stand for public office. The legislation was part of a wider package of measures conceived to support integration by offering immigrants equal treatment. But crucially, and perhaps most destructively for Swedish society, they did not integrate these immigrants evenly into the population. Yes, that's correct. They basically segregated their own society, and it backfired on them. And let me explain. Between the years 1965 and 1974, the Swedish government carried out the Million program. This was an effort to provide 1 million new and high-quality housing units to all Swedish citizens. And I know what you're thinking here at this moment. Ooh, a housing project. Yeah, Stack, how threatening. And yeah, I mean, this was a good thing for the public in general. But in a country with a population of 8 million people at the time, though, this was the most ambitious public housing project in the entire world. I mean, we're talking 1 million houses. If the United States declared that they were going to build 1 million public housing units, that in and of itself would be a pretty big deal now. And this is Sweden with 8 million people. These housing units were designed to meet a variety of income levels and not just be low-income projects. They were built outside of the main cities in Sweden, and so to this day, you can find hundreds of thousands of housing units in the suburbs of Sweden's largest cities. There was just one problem. When the immigrants came to Sweden, they tended to mostly put them in the same housing units during the Million program. In fact, there's an interesting level of overlap with the map of the Million program homes and the current distribution of what Sweden has come to call the, quote, vulnerable areas. More on that later. So, okay, they put most of the migrants in the same place instead of spreading them out throughout the country. And guess what happened? They ended up creating the problem that they currently deal with. Massive amounts of immigrants, all grouped together, who formed in-groups and a society within the overall Swedish society that separated them from native-born Swedes. And this is how, if you travel to Sweden, if you stay in the major cities, you'll actually be safe for the most part. And that is because Swedes did what hardly anyone in the world had done, and created ghettos and slums in the suburbs instead of in the inner cities by shipping all of the immigrants to the new housing units just outside of town. Eventually, these Million program housing units would gain the same stigma that concentrated tower blocks in England or Section 8 housing in the United States would receive. Low income, typically ethnic minorities, and specifically to Sweden, mostly immigrants, would dwell in these places, and the youth began to form groups. Now, anyone who has studied programs involving immigration can tell you that once young people start forming their own in-groups in a society due to perceived lack of being allowed in the overall group, or whether it is due to their own specific culture and religious beliefs that may stop them from wanting to integrate with the outside world, this can be a bit of a problem. In the United States, this was perfectly exemplified by the Irish and Italian gangs of New York in the 19th century, or the Chicago gangs that flourished in Southern California starting after World War II. If these immigrant youth were not properly integrated into society, they would form their own societies for protection typically, or to advance themselves. and those groups typically turn into gangs. The same thing here happened in Sweden. And as the number of immigrants swelled, different ethnic groups began to overlap on each other's territory, leading to inevitable violence. Now, many of these angry young men would express their frustrations through music, and coinciding with global music trends, they began to develop their own form of gangster rap music. Much in the style of Chicago's O-Block rappers, these Swedish gangs began bragging about their exploits and calling out rivals through their lyrics. Meanwhile, the debatably unintentional segregation of Swedish society would continue and only worsen. The violence would eventually spill out over the Million Program housing blocks and into the wider area, and it got more organized as well as deadly. Due to an odd quirk of Swedish law, they continued to get away with their crimes too. Now, a number of people may be confused about this, but I'm going to provide some clarification. In most countries, there is a minimum age of criminal responsibility. This is technically the age at which they could be tried as an adult for their crimes. In the United States, as an example, the minimum age of criminal responsibility is 11 years old for federal crimes only. And America probably isn't the best example since nearly half the states don't even have a minimum age of responsibility, whereas in other states, like Texas, for instance, the minimum age is 17 years old. Now, this is a function of the United States being basically 50 countries disguised as a trench coat, but for a better frame of reference, we should look at European countries, though. In Scotland and the Netherlands, the minimum age is 12 years old. In Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the age is 15 years old. The rest of Europe ranges from 7 to 18 years, but 15 is still on the higher end, even in their geopolitical neighborhood. Basically, if you are that age of minimum responsibility or older than that, when you commit a crime, you go to jail. Anyone younger than that who commits a crime will go to a juvenile court system if one exists in their country. But here's the problem. Sweden, as it turns out, has no juvenile court system. Under Swedish law, in fact, no person can be subjected to criminal sanction for an offense committed while under the age of 15. In the Swedish societal mindset, which is quite progressive if you want to call it that, diverting offenders from criminal courts, for example by issuing cautions, has traditionally been used for young boys and girls rather than for adults because the legal process itself is thought to harm children. In fact, they tend to typically avoid even sending anyone to jail that is younger than 21, as they believe it sets them up for reincarceration once they've been in the prison system during their formative years, so they would rather not do that. Now, whether or not that approach actually works is debatable, considering what's happened in Sweden in recent years, and I know the comments are going to have an absolute field day with this one. But it should be noted that this is what Sweden was trying to do. They were trying to think about the kids that would be getting institutionalized and prevent that from happening. This ideology regarding prosecution of minors would face its toughest challenge going into the 2010s, however. The peculiar thing about Swedish gangs is that, for the longest time, they were all pretty small. Consisting of as little as 3 or 4 individuals, these gangs made up for what they lacked in size with sheer quantity. There would be thousands of them, not just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 major ones. We're talking thousands of tiny little gangs. And quickly, they realized the loopholes offered to minors by the Swedish criminal system and decided to take advantage of it. These groups specifically began to seek out those that were under the age of 15 in order to help perpetuate their criminal activities. Suddenly, kids as young as 10 years old were being found with large quantities of drugs, or maybe even a firearm in their backpack. Meanwhile, the rap scene in Sweden did nothing to lessen the tension. In Rinkeby, rival gangs called the Shotas and the Dödspatrullen, or Death Patrol, began to wage war on each other. These two gangs, mostly made up of Somali Swedes and inspired by London's drill music scene, were not only causing havoc locally, but their reach would spill out into the country as a whole and even crossed over to Copenhagen. In 2020, their gang rivalry resulted in double murders in Denmark. One of the leaders of the Shotas, Yasin Abudali, an award-winning rapper, had become both a symbol of the problem and a source of local pride somehow. He had been involved in the killing of Sweden's leading rap star, Einar, in 2021. And when Einar died, the violence exploded, quite literally. You see, the trend in the previous decade in Sweden has been to use explosive devices to eliminate your ops. From things as simple as stolen grenades to homemade pipe bombs, these attacks would strike terror in the heart of innocent people across Sweden and shattered the peaceful image and reputation of the Swedes. Regardless of their compassion, they simply hadn't planned for the possible outcomes that come from having such an open immigration system. By this point, the problem had become critical. And out of every 4 people in Sweden, 1 of them is either foreign-born or the child of 1 or more foreign-born parents. In the void left behind the war between the Shotas and the Death Patrol, a gang called Foxtrot would rise up to the top of the criminal syndicates in Sweden. This criminal network would aim to become Sweden's main distributor of narcotics. Rawa Majid, also known as the Kurdish Fox, is Foxtrot's leader. Swedish police can't even touch the Kurdish Fox because he escaped to Turkey and bought citizenship there, and Turkey refuses to extradite him back to Sweden because, well, he bought citizenship from them. So, he now fully controls the organization from the safety of Turkey. As it stands, the most recent reports indicate that 14,000 people in Sweden are involved with criminal gangs, but another 48,000 are believed to be connected to them. And it's important to realize that immigration, when we talk about this is not the sole reason for Sweden's crime problem. It is a significant factor, arguably the majority factor to be sure, but there are still other factors that come into play here. Sweden's evolving crime scene went from the indigenous biker gangs in the 1980s, to the Yugoslav-Serbian gang of the 90s, to the new hybrid transnational crime network that, bizarrely enough, feels very inclusive, for lack of a better word. I don't really know how else it is that I would explain that. And the native-born Swedes are complicit in this too by creating the demand for drugs that the gangs began smuggling and selling. Somewhere along the way, the Swedes fell in love with cocaine. Traces of it have been found in the Swedish parliament. Cocaine coursed through Stockholm's veins, or rather, its sewage system, as researchers discovered. During just 1 week in October of 2019, Stockholmers smoked nearly 1.8 million doses of cannabis, snorted 33,670 lines of cocaine, and took over 451,000 doses of amphetamine. That was $3 million spent on drugs, with much of it passing through Malmö. The new generations were more gun literate and were no longer content with AK-47s and Makarovs, but wanted Glocks, Smith & Wessons, and Berettas. And though the Balkans is still the main supplier of weapons, this is something that has been already changing steadily as arms from Ukraine trickle into the Balkans. This sudden influx of guns in a mostly gun-free society would turn Sweden from having one of the lowest gun-related deaths in the world to being tied with Albania for the most gun deaths in Europe per capita. As you can imagine, this would be pretty bad, and you can likely guess where lots of this would be concentrated. However, Swedish police do not currently map gang members' nationalities. Research, though, for the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention in 2021, though, would show young people born in Sweden to 2 parents from abroad were significantly more overrepresented as suspects in murder cases and robberies. It's also telling that the majority of this new crime is happening in the suburbs surrounding Sweden's 3 largest cities: Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. Parts of the Stockholm and Malmö suburbs feel less safe than Baghdad, and it's not too much better for the rest of Sweden's more than 60 vulnerable areas. Now, media has on occasion used the expression no-go areas in order to describe such areas, as emergency services such as fire engines and ambulances on occasion cannot drive into these areas during an elevated situation without a police escort, as they will be attacked by criminal gangs. The usage of this term is, though, less accurate and compares these places to literal war zones, and its use is more likely to be used to emotionally charge the situation on the ground versus an actual reflection of the accurate situation. Now, it's not that they can't ever go to these parts of town to do their jobs, it's just that on occasion, this is something that does happen. But really, who would want to go into the direction of gunfire if it's still going on? Even in the United States, paramedics often won't appear on the scene to a shooting if there are still bullets flying, and they will wait for a police escort to arrive in order to be able to render aid. This is something that does happen around the world daily. That is something that I need to stress right now. So it is then, my friends, that those on the right of Sweden's politics tend to use these areas in order to say that immigrants are the reason for crime issues within the country. And while this is certainly a factor, and this is true, it is not only that. Not all of the vulnerable areas are immigrant communities. There is just a large percentage of them. The one thing that really all these areas have here in common, though, is poverty. The reason that we describe any of this in the first place as a vulnerable area is that a vulnerable area is described as being geographically defined and having a low socioeconomic status and criminals negatively affecting society. The 3 categories of vulnerable area are divided according to the severity. You have vulnerable areas, risk areas, and especially vulnerable areas. These are areas in which drugs and violence have taken root due to a lack of opportunity, not necessarily due to ethnicity, though this can be true depending upon set gang activity. It's also important to remember that for those in this area who are immigrants, it's not necessarily that many people were asking to flee their countries. Many of them could have done so under threat of punishment or death if they stayed, while others came because of economic opportunity. It can vary depending upon their specific situation. Education levels, though, in these areas tend to be far lower than general population, where 40% of the population has not even completed primary education. According to Swedish national statistics, persons with only primary education are 5.7 times more likely to be registered for crime compared to people with post-secondary education. And that statistic is regardless of ethnicity and is directly related to availability of education and poverty. Unfortunately, this lack of education resources seems to actually be getting worse over the last few years. As such, one of the major problems that can be argued in this case when talking about Sweden and immigration is that such widespread immigration was performed without a real plan in place to be able to take in new citizens, to make them feel welcomed in the first place, and simultaneously to integrate them into society. Yes, they gave out free Swedish lessons, but they never really encouraged communities to mix, to mingle with each other. They never encouraged them to learn the local ways and customs. They never encouraged them to become Swedes, really. This becomes a significantly greater problem when incorporating people from cultures that are very alien to the native population and simultaneously, in extreme cases, despise the native-born population, beliefs, customs, and more. Arguably, this is similar to a couple getting married when they are of two different religions. If you don't talk about it, things can get confusing and it could end very poorly. As just one example of this, many children of immigrants would take advantage of the Swedes' reliance on their government to dictate social norms. This meant that these children would tell their first-gen immigrant parents that if they disciplined them by getting hit, then they would call the police on them and claim abuse. So the parents, being scared to lose their children due to a cultural difference, would sometimes just straight up stop disciplining them altogether. It also doesn't help that Sweden has a really low amount of police officers per capita, and they're famously known for being very laid back in the first place compared to their global peers. Of course, that is something that would likely be changing considering the amount of crime that is being seen. And of course, it should be stated at this point that the Swedish population, for the most part, doesn't necessarily hate immigrants. Immigration is becoming an increasingly more negative topic. Actual racist incidents are extremely uncommon in Sweden, unless you go and burn a Quran. Because yeah, there was a case of an activist being shot who burned the Quran. Think what you will about that, because we here at the channel are not going to be stepping into that particular political quagmire, at least not now, because that is a whole issue right there. Either way, while the Swedes don't necessarily hate immigrants themselves, that doesn't mean that they don't acknowledge the situation that they're in and how they got here, and the problem specifically with the cultural integration of people who seem to despise their way of life. And as such, many of them are ready for the flow of migrants to stop. By September of 2022, following riots in several Swedish towns and an admission by then Prime Minister at the time, Magdalena Andersson, that Sweden had failed to integrate vast numbers of immigrants, the break with Sweden's historic tradition was nearly complete. The anti-immigration right-wing Swedish Democrats Party would score 20% of the vote in the general elections. The rest of the government, made up of center-right moderates, liberals, and Christian Democrats, would form a three-party coalition and invited the SD to take part in the elaboration of their strategy in exchange for the SD's support in parliament. After this, the Tito Agreement, a document of 63 pages with 1/3 of its content dedicated to migration, guaranteed the SD an important role in governing the country. As Karlstad University professor Tobias Hübinette would say, quote, "The SD is a party that was founded in 1998 and that has always focused on migration as part of its political agenda. The coalition agreement was a dream come true for them because they will get large parts of their migration policy passed as specified in the coalition agreement." As a result of this, the rise of this more right-wing party is something that is striking for many people in Europe that have not seen that in years. But considering everything we've talked about, it's not really all that surprising. I should specify here right now, as when people use the term right-wing, left-wing, far left, far right, that in many cases this is something that is not necessarily accurate, at least when talking about global trends, and also just not realistic. We should remind you that a far-right party in Sweden is still something that is far more moderate compared to what we in America would likely label far-right or far-left being said. Like, as just one example of a controversial statement, in 2014, the SD did go and suggest that granting citizenship would be contingent on an immigrant going and swearing allegiance to the Swedish king, which raised some controversy at the time. But then simultaneously, one can say, okay, well, if you're swearing allegiance to a flag to the king, and the king is literally the ruler of the country, this is something that you would think would likely be standard, but that was controversial. Moving on from that, the SD currently supports a ban on wearing the hijab and burqa in Swedish society. Also, in 2023, SD leader Jimmy Åkesson would argue that Swedish mosques which preach anti-democratic, anti-Swedish, homophobic, anti-Semitic propaganda should be closed and demolished, and expressed opposition to the construction of new Islamic buildings. Considering the increasing radicalization that we are seeing across Europe, this is something that is becoming more and more commonly spouted. Along with this, in January of 2024, Richard Jomshof, chairman of the Justice Committee in the Riksdag, would ignite controversy in Sweden by proposing the prohibition of Islamic stars and crescents. He drew parallels to the ban on the swastika, claiming that both symbols represented something dangerous. This and many more things have been proposed, but perhaps the most level-headed and realistic of the SD's ideas, though, is to change the process of granting asylum to just being temporary citizenship in Sweden as opposed to being permanent. The Tito Agreement did make some changes to the immigration system that have had noticeable effects, though, such as stricter requirements for obtaining Swedish citizenship and expanding the circumstances under which immigrants can be deported back to their home countries. And those new policies will soon be tested, as the level of violence just keeps on mounting in Sweden. If you thought this video was going to be about a story about how Sweden went and fixed its crime problem, well, no, I'm sorry, that's not what's happening. Instead, Swedish officials have been increasingly admitting that they've lost control of the situation, and they're just trying to keep up with the violence as best as they can. And of course, remember at this time how I mentioned that guns are entering the country much more commonly nowadays? Well, you'd think that maybe that would cut down on the bombings, but no, they've actually increased. In the month of January of 2025, there was an average of a bombing per day in Sweden. The bombings have gotten so bad that currently Sweden has the highest rate of explosive device incidents for a country that is not at war, with the sole exception being Mexico. You can only imagine how incredibly bad that is and why this would be something that would be driving people's fears. At this point, now at the time that I even make this, and the whole reason why this video came into existence in the first place is not just because of the recent bombing incidents, which brought this to my attention in the first place, but simultaneously there is a talk now of monitoring the social media activities of anyone under the age of 15, because gangs have been recruiting 12 and 13-year-olds through social media networks to do their bidding. If this sounds crazy, yeah, and when we talk about it, one good indicator of just how prevalent crime is in a society is how much it costs to pay someone to take the life of another human for you. In Sweden, the going rate for murder is as little as $5,000, and that rate is actually dropping as more and more people are taking up the offer. Typically, that buys you a kid dropping a live grenade or a pipe bomb outside of the door of your ops, but sometimes they get the address wrong and innocent people have died out of the confusion. These detonations have increased from 90 explosions in 2018 to over 150 last year. At the point that I'm talking about this, it's pretty much guaranteed that Sweden is going to need to hire and fund thousands of more police officers in the next few years. Although the police are improving slowly, to be sure, it is still a major issue. They've reduced the gun violence rate with some moderate success, but that has just made bombings increase in frequency. And, that being said, Sweden is definitely on track to have more than 400 bombings take place this year, which is leaving many of the population worried if the police can even get a grip on the problem in the first place. This problem is bad, and it is only getting worse. And the worse that things get, the more likely it is that people will begin to seek, or at least take a second look, at some of the more extreme ideas that have been put forth by varying different political parties, with a chance that some of the more fringe ones will take greater shares of power than they normally would be capable of. So, will Sweden truly ever get a grip on this epidemic of crime? We can't really be sure. They've definitely slowed down the flood of immigration to just a trickle in the past couple of years, yes, but can they actually handle and solve the problems that the gangs, the drugs, and the violence have brought to the country already? Only time will tell. And of course, we'll be sure to touch back on that subject as soon as a new significant development arises. Either way, in the end here, my friends, thank you all for watching. Please be sure to check out our Patreon or perhaps our merch, as I've said in many cases, but wait, it gets worse, and depending on how things go, modern problems may require more medieval and severe solutions. All of this is linked down in the description below. I appreciate you very much. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye, my friends, and best of luck.